Imagine living in a country where a highly trained cardiovascular surgeon makes less money in an entire month than a taxi driver makes in a single afternoon.
Yeah, it's a wild concept.
It really sounds like an impossible riddle. But right now, for millions of people, it is just a daily grinding reality.
Absolutely.
I mean, imagine waking up to shelves that are completely bare. The streets outside your window are humming with this silent, incredibly tense energy.
Right, that quiet fear.
Exactly. And ordinary people, your neighbors, your teachers, your mechanics, they're caught in this terrifying tug of war between a conditioned fear and a rising, undeniable anger.
It's palpable.
So the question is, what happens when a society is pushed right to the absolute brink?
Well, you get a powder keg.
Yeah.
And right now, we are watching the fuse burn down in real time.
Welcome to today's Deep Dive. We've got a massive stack of notes in front of us today, centered around a brilliantly detailed geopolitical analysis by Trân Thanh Truc.
It's an incredible piece of research.
It really is. And our mission today is to strip away all that abstract, high-level political rhetoric you hear on the news and figure out exactly how tightening international pressure, along with internal fractures, are fundamentally altering the daily lives of Cuba's citizens.
Because, honestly, this isn't just your standard policy briefing.
No, not at all.
If we follow the trajectory of this analysis, we're looking at a cinematic arc of escalation. It's a story that starts with the suffocating grip of U.S. economic pressure, right?
Right.
And then it bleeds into the exhausting reality of daily survival.
Mm-hmm.
It reveals these deep structural cracks forming in the pavement of a rigidly controlled society.
Like a slow-burning fuse.
Exactly. And it leads us to the ultimate unavoidable question, which is a historic, decades-old system finally about to break?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the tension on the streets of Havana or Santiago, we first have to look at the invisible forces squeezing the island from the outside.
The geopolitical vice.
Yeah, the analysis zeroes in on the severe escalation of U.S. pressure, specifically highlighting the policy shifts enacted during the Trump II era. But we hear the word sanctions all the time.
People throw that word around constantly.
They do. So what are the actual mechanics here? Because this isn't just a general trade embargo anymore, is it?
Not at all. What's fascinating here is that it is a highly targeted, comprehensive squeezing of Cuba's economic arteries.
Wow.
The source details a massive escalation, but two mechanisms really stand out for their sheer devastating impact.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, there's the activation of Title III of the Helms-Burton Act. Now, for decades, U.S. presidents actually waived this provision.
Oh, they just ignored it.
Basically, yeah, because it's so aggressive. But once activated, it allowed U.S. citizens to sue foreign companies that were profiting from property confiscated during the Cuban Revolution.
Wait, so if a European hotel chain wants to build a resort in Veradero?
They suddenly face massive lawsuits in U.S. federal courts.
Wow.
Yeah, it creates this massive chilling effect. Foreign investment essentially freezes completely because the legal compliance risk is just way too high.
That makes sense. And the second mechanism?
Second, you have Cuba's placement on the State Sponsor of Terrorism list, the SSOT designation.
Right, the SSOT.
This is basically the financial kill switch. Because the global banking system is so intertwined with the U.S. dollar, almost no international bank wants to touch a transaction involving a country on that list.
Because they're terrified of U.S. fines.
Exactly. They fear devastating penalties.
Meaning, Cuba literally cannot process the payments required to buy basic goods on the international market, even from countries that actually want to sell to them.
They are entirely locked down.
And it's like a modern-day siege. But hold on. Looking at the geopolitical strategy here, I have to push back a little bit based on this source material.
Sure, good.
If the U.S. goal is permanent containment, keeping Cuba weakened so it can't project power, isn't there a massive glaring risk here?
You mean the blowback?
Yeah. Pushing a state 90 miles off the coast of Florida into total economic collapse seems incredibly counterproductive. Doesn't that just guarantee a massive, chaotic refugee crisis right on America's doorstep?
Well, that is the exact strategic ambiguity this analysis wrestles with. The source asks this really critical open question.
Which is?
Does Washington actually want regime change, like a total, potentially chaotic toppling of the government?
Mm-hmm.
Or is the goal just to ensure the Cuban model remains a visible, struggling failure in the hemisphere?
Ah, I see.
If it's the latter, the severe economic pain isn't just a byproduct. It is the intended feature.
Right. It's working exactly as designed.
Exactly. But you are entirely right to point out the risk. The architects of these policies are walking a razor-thin line between forcing political concessions and triggering a catastrophic humanitarian exodus.
And that really brings us to the human cost. Because macroeconomic policies signed in an office in Washington, they don't just stay on paper.
No, they trickle down instantly.
Instantly to the dinner table. And we really need to talk about what that inescapability feels like.
It's grim.
It is. The notes detail severe, crippling shortages of absolute basic necessities. We're talking food, fuel, electricity, water. But let's connect the dots here.
Okay.
How does a banking sanction in Washington translate into a 12-hour blackout for a family in Santa Clara?
Well, it really comes down to oil and infrastructure. You see, Cuba relies heavily on imported crude oil, which was historically subsidized by Venezuela, to run its power grid.
Okay.
But the U.S. specifically targeted the international shipping companies and the physical vessels that transport that Venezuelan oil to Cuba.
Oh, wow. So if a shipping company transports the oil,
They get sanctioned.
so the ships just start coming.
The ships stop coming, the fuel reserves dry up, and Cuba's power plants, which are heavily reliant on old Soviet-era technology anyway.
And probably suffering from decades of deferred maintenance, right?
Exactly.
Yep.
They simply cannot operate. The grid physically fails, hence the rolling blackouts.
I really want you, listening to this right now, to put yourself in the shoes of a family described in the source material.
Yeah, it's a powerful anecdote.
Imagine waking up in the sweltering heat because your fan stopped working in the middle of the night. You have a 12-hour blackout ahead of you.
And no relief in sight.
None. You have to hunt desperately just to find enough gasoline to get across town. And then you stand in a queue for hours under the boiling sun just to buy a daily ration of rice or chicken.
If they even have any left.
Right. And while you're in that line, the money in your pocket is literally losing value by the minute. The inflation described in these notes is just staggering.
Staggering is almost an understatement, honestly. The sort highlights inflation rates soaring into the hundreds of percent.
That's unbelievable.
It renders the local currency effectively useless for a standard family.
But, this is where I want to dive into the fierce debate our source brings up.
The big controversy.
Yeah, because it is very easy to look at a 400% inflation rate and the lack of fuel and say, well, the U.S. cut off their oxygen, so of course they are suffocating.
And there is undeniable truth to that.
There is. But is this crushing daily reality entirely the fault of U.S. policy? Or is it exposing the deep internal rot of Cuba's own systemic failures?
That is the most highly charged debate in the entire geopolitical analysis. And the author presents both perspectives with exacting detail.
Okay, so let's look at the internal argument.
Right, so critics point out that long before maximum pressure sanctions were ever applied, Cuba's rigidly centralized, state-run economy was fundamentally broken.
Like the agricultural sector, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's entirely managed by the state, and it has historically struggled with staggering inefficiency. I mean, they have fertile land, yet they have to import the vast majority of their food.
And then there is the currency crisis, which the government essentially did to itself.
Yes, the dual currency.
The notes break down the collapse of the dual currency system. For years, Cuba had two currencies, right? You had the CUP for state salaries, and then the CUC, which was pegged to the dollar for tourists and imported goods.
Right, and when the government finally decided to unify them, a policy they called the Tarea Ordenamiento, the timing and execution were just disastrous.
Oh, completely.
They effectively wiped out citizens' savings overnight and severely devalued the currency right in the middle of a global crisis. The state's own monetary policies fueled the hyperinflation just as much as external isolation did.
So it's not just a siege from the outside. It's an engine trying to run on a flawed, outdated blueprint on the inside.
That's a great way to put it.
You have the external sanctions pushing in and the internal command economy failures pushing out. And for the regular population, it doesn't matter whose fault it is when the refrigerator is empty and the lights go out.
No, it doesn't.
The result is a psychological pressure cooker.
And when a mother can't use her state salary to buy a single carton of eggs because the money is worthless, that economic pain doesn't just stay in the kitchen.
No, it spills into the streets.
Exactly. Which brings us to the profound social fracturing happening right now.
Right. When people spend their days fighting just to survive, exhaustion eventually turns into action.
Always.
The deep dive moves from the economic reality to the societal breaking point. We are seeing major cracks in the pavement, particularly among the youth and the working class.
The demographics are shifting.
And the notes introduce a fascinating dynamic here, the rise of the MI-PIAMs, These are the new, small private enterprises the government recently allowed to operate.
Yes, out of sheer desperation, the state began allowing these small private businesses to import and sell goods. But it created a massive paradox.
How so?
Well, these private businesses import food and supplies, but they have to sell them at global capitalist market prices.
Meanwhile, the vast majority of the population is still earning socialist, state-controlled salaries.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like trying to run a car engine on two completely different types of fuel simultaneously.
Eventually, the engine knocks, stutters, and tears itself apart.
Precisely. You have supermarkets with goods on the shelves, but ordinary people just walk past them because a bottle of cooking oil costs half their monthly salary.
That's heartbreaking.
It has created a glaring, unprecedented level of social inequality.
And that inequality just shatters the social contract. I mean, for decades, the Cuban state relied on a unified public front.
The grand bargains?
Yeah, the deal was you give up certain political freedoms, and the state guarantees your basic needs, housing, healthcare, education, food.
Right.
But if the state can no longer provide the food or keep the lights on, the youth are looking around and saying, what exactly are we defending?
That generational divide is so crucial to understand. You have older government loyalists who view the struggle as a necessary, heroic defense of sovereignty against American imperialism.
The old guard.
Right. But the youth, who never lived through those romanticized days of the revolution, they are demanding immediate reform because they simply cannot endure the status quo anymore.
Here's where it gets really interesting. How are these demands turning into actual street protests?
It's a logistical nightmare for the state.
Because the state controls the television, the radio, the newspapers. How does a frustrated student in Havana coordinate with a mechanic in Santiago to actually organize dissent?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the catalyst is the internet.
Aha, of course.
The analysis highlights the rollout of mobile internet data in Cuba over the last decade. The government introduced it to modernize, right? But it acted as a massive unintended pressure valve.
It bypassed all the traditional channels.
Suddenly, people weren't relying on state media. They were on WhatsApp, Telegram, and Facebook.
They could see that they weren't alone. Like, if someone in one town streams a protest from their phone, 1,000 people in another town see it in real time.
Exactly. It's a contagion effect.
Yeah. And that culminated in the historic waves of protests spanning from the monumental July 11th uprisings in 2021 all the way through 2026.
And, you know, the historical weight of those protests really cannot be overstated. For half a century, the public display of dissent in Cuba on that scale was literally unimaginable.
It was unheard of.
The psychological barrier of fear was completely broken.
The source highlights this incredibly tense anecdote of a student group protesting.
Yeah, that part gave me chills.
Me too. Imagine taking to the streets, shouting for freedom and food, while your own family watches from the sidelines in absolute tense anxiety.
Because they know what's coming.
Exactly. They know exactly what kind of strict control measures are coming. The state doesn't just watch these protests happen.
No, not at all. They utilize what political scientists call regime survival tactics.
What does that look like on the ground?
Well, when the protests peak, the state physically throttles or completely cuts the internet to stop that contagion effect we talked about.
Plunge everything into the dark.
Yeah. And then they deploy security forces, and they hand down severe, decades-long prison sentences to demonstrators just to reestablish that barrier of fear.
Wow. It takes immense bravery or, perhaps immense desperation to walk into the street knowing that's the guaranteed response.
It really does.
But it forces the critical question posed in our notes. Are these street protests actually powerful enough to force systemic change? Or are they just temporary waves crashing against an immovable fortified wall?
And that is the pivotal uncertainty of this entire analysis. Because a rigidly controlled socialist model relies on projecting invulnerability.
Right.
The state has proven incredibly resilient over the decades. But resilience isn't infinite. A system can only absorb so much internal fracturing before the sheer logistical and psychological cost of maintaining control exceeds the actual capacity of the state.
Which logically brings us to the ultimate endgame here.
The breaking point.
Exactly. With the youth protesting, the economic vice tightening, the power grid failing, and the societal fabric tearing apart. Where does a system go when it is pushed past its absolute limit?
Well, the analysis outlines 3 potential scenarios for Cuba's future, and each one of them carries massive global implications.
Okay, let's go through them. What's the first scenario?
The first scenario is internal, meaningful reform.
Okay.
The government, recognizing the existential threat, initiates systemic changes from within. They fully open up the economy to private enterprise, decentralize agriculture, and perhaps initiate some political pluralism, transitioning slowly just to avoid total collapse.
But, I mean, given the entrenched interests of the state bureaucracy, that seems like the hardest needle to thread.
It's highly unlikely to be smooth, yeah.
So what's the second scenario?
The second scenario is the one that really keeps regional diplomats awake at night, and that's the total collapse of the socialist model.
Total collapse.
Yeah, the economic pressure simply becomes too great. The state apparatus fractures. The military or police refuse to crack down on their own starving neighbors, and the system falls apart entirely.
Terrifying. And the third?
The third scenario is what we might call muddling through.
Muddling through.
Maintaining the status quo through limited, minor concessions. The government does just enough to relieve the immediate pressure of the protests, maybe loosening a few import restrictions or blaming specific local officials for failures.
So they survive day by day.
Right, but aggressively refusing to alter the fundamental centralized structure of the state.
So what does this all mean? Why should you, listening to this deep dive right now, care about the internal structure of an island nation of 11 million people?
Because nature and geopolitics absolutely abhors a vacuum.
Exactly.
The analysis explores the massive debate over what a Cuban collapse would mean globally. Ideologically, Cuba has been a symbolic anchor, a defiant fortress for over half a century.
It's an icon for certain movements.
Its collapse would be a psychological earthquake for leftist movements across Latin America and the world. But strategically, it's even bigger.
Let's talk about the strategic side.
If the U.S. pushes Cuba to the absolute brink, who steps in to offer a lifeline?
Russia and China.
Exactly. And we are already seeing it happen. As the U.S. squeezes harder, Cuba leans heavier into alliances with Moscow and Beijing.
A survival tactic.
They offer debt restructuring and oil shipments in exchange for a strategic geopolitical foothold 90 miles from the United States. It alters the balance of power in the entire hemisphere.
Let's look at the hypothetical future if the system does fracture and Cuba transitions towards democracy and a free market capitalist economy.
It's a heavily debated topic.
There are two very distinct sides to this coin in the source material. On the opportunity side, the potential is undeniable.
Oh, absolutely.
You have the prospect of massive international investment, the lifting of the U.S. embargo, integration into the global supply chain, and a theoretically massive leap in the standard of living for the citizens currently queuing for rations.
But the risks of that transition are profoundly dangerous. The debate in the notes is incredibly polarized on this.
How so?
Would Cuba become a shining, prosperous model of democracy in the Caribbean? Or would the sudden shock of a free market transition lead to immediate chaotic failure? We have to impartially weigh those risks.
Right, because you can't just flip a switch from socialism to capitalism.
Oh, that's impossible.
It's like trying to graft a high-speed rail network onto a 19th century dirt road overnight. You can lay down the modern tracks, like the free market principles, but without the foundational infrastructure, the whole thing derails immediately.
That is the perfect way to look at it. When a rigidly structured, state-controlled society is suddenly dismantled, the resulting vacuum is highly volatile.
Because the institutions aren't there.
Exactly. The actual infrastructure required for a functional democratic capitalist society, things like independent courts to enforce contracts, property rights, anti-corruption regulatory bodies, and a cultural understanding of political pluralism. That stuff does not just materialize out of thin air.
It takes generations to build.
Generations.
So the fear is that a sudden, unmanaged transition doesn't lead to widespread prosperity, but to oligarchy.
Precisely.
A handful of connected insiders or foreign corporations buy up the state assets for pennies, deep social inequality explodes even further, and you get severe political instability as different factions vie for power in a newly opened, lawless system.
The transition itself could be just as painful, if not more violently chaotic, than the current paralysis.
It is just a staggering reality to consider, and the notes we are working from heavily hint that this is a rapidly escalating situation.
It's not static at all.
No, we are not looking at a static picture. In fact, Turnthan Truk's analysis teases that there is much more to uncover on this geopolitical chessboard.
There's a whole other layer.
The next focus of these notes, which we'll definitely have to explore in our next deep dive, dives into the very specific upcoming mechanics of U.S. sanctions and exactly how the Cuban government is planning to retaliate diplomatically and economically.
The chess match is far from over.
Not by a long shot.
The tension is only escalating, and the global stakes are getting higher by the month. And, as we consider the potential for a total systemic collapse, we are left with a final, profound consideration to weigh.
What's that?
If everything gives way, and a system that has stood isolated, rigid, and defiant for decades shatters overnight, who exactly steps into the vacuum to pick up the pieces?
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this exploration helped you cut through the static and understand the profound human complexities behind the geopolitical headlines. Keep questioning the narratives you hear, look closely at the invisible forces shaping our world, and as you go about your day, let your mind linger on that unsettling image of a nation and millions of ordinary lives standing right on a knife's edge.